Hey guys, I want to do a short video to show you a trigger modification that I did on my WE G17. So I bought this WE G17 new, and when I got it out of the box it had just a horrible trigger on it. What would happen would be the trigger would get stuck. So as I pulled the trigger to the break point, it would get stuck right there, and then I'd have to push it some more to actually fire the pistol in order for the sear to release the hammer. So it functioned properly, but it just felt horrible. So I wanted to figure out, well, what's causing that? How does the trigger work? And is there any way I can fix it? So as you know, this WE G17 is a clone of a Marui G17, which I also have, and I have no problem with the Marui because it's a much higher quality pistol and the tolerances are much better and tighter. But I thought, well, let me give this a shot to see if I can fix it. And I did a modification to the trigger bar and I actually have this working exactly how I want to now. As you can see, I've got a nice smooth trigger pull right to the break point, and then it will break, and then it resets properly right there and right to the break point again, and it's just a really nice trigger now. So I'm just going to show you what we did to solve that problem. So you'll need to disassemble the slide. So remove the slide. We have to remove the housing, the hammer housing block in the back. Do that by removing this pin. We have to remove this screw right here. And we're going to slide this housing up. Now be careful, this is the valve blocker and there is a spring in there and you don't want to lose that, so just put your thumb over that as you take that out. And then if you have to pull your trigger just a little bit, that's going to release the trigger bar up a little higher so that you can manipulate this housing away from the trigger bar. And I would just go ahead and remove your valve blocker and your spring so that it doesn't get lost. So here's your housing. Next I'm going to remove my trigger bar, so I'm going to show you how this actually works. So instead of removing this whole assembly and that screw from the frame, I found it easier just to remove this pin from the trigger itself, and that will release, we got a little bug here, that will release the trigger bar. One end of that pin is knurled, so I don't remember how it comes from the factory. I'm going to push mine out from the right hand side. And here's that pin, and I don't know if you can see, but there is a little, it is knurled on the end there. So you just have to lift out your trigger bar, release it from the spring, and there you go. Now you'll see this trigger bar is, on the end of it, it's shaped like a L, and this bottom tab, or this bottom part of the L, is actually what pushes on the sear and releases the hammer. This top part of the trigger is what gets pushed down by the slide, and that's what resets your trigger. It also disconnects it from the sear so that it's not firing in full auto. This is the G17, which is the semi-auto model. So here's our housing. So I'm going to show you how this works. Is that there's the trigger bar rides along this space right here, and there's a little tab or a slot that comes up and then back. So what happens is that the trigger bar rides in this slot. As you pull the trigger, it moves back and it pushes this little tab. There's a tab on the sear right there. Pushes back on that tab and releases your hammer. I'm going to try to focus this a little bit better. Let me try a different setting here. It's not letting me change it. Alright, so your hammer is released by the sear as the sear is pushed back by the trigger bar, just like that. So the problem I was having was that the trigger bar would come back and move up into this notch and get stuck there before it actually pushed the sear back to release the hammer. And that's why that trigger was getting stuck where it was before it actually released the hammer, before the break point. So I needed to close this gap. So one thing I could do is try to add more material to this to move this step backwards a little bit. Don't think that's really an option. So the second option could have been to maybe add material to this tab on the sear on the forward or the front end of that. And instead of messing with that, I thought, well, let me see what I can do to the trigger bar. Maybe there's something I can do to the trigger bar in case I mess it up. That's an easier fix. Let me show you this Marui housing block. See if I can get this to focus. So with this Marui, first maybe you can see that this tab that's on the sear is taller. It's more material in there, so it's taller. And you can see where this step is right here, that there's less space right there. So that space is smaller than the trigger bar tab, so that the trigger bar has no choice but to move backwards and release the hammer and then move up. So, you know, we tried to replicate that, but they just didn't get it right. Now, why is this tab here in the first place? Why is that there? Well, that's there to replicate a real Glock, because when you fire a Glock and you pull the trigger stays after it fires, or if you dry fire it, the trigger stays backwards until it's reset by the slide. And what this notch is doing, what Marui and what we are trying to do, is to replicate that in the Airsoft version. We just didn't get it right. So here is the trigger bar. So what I did on this was I needed to close that space up, so what I did was widen this tab on the bottom. You see this is like an L shape, so this is the bottom of the L. And I just used some shim stock. I used brass. Now honestly, I don't know how long the brass is going to last because it might wear pretty quickly. Hasn't worn out yet. Maybe I should have used a piece of steel or something, but I just used a thin piece of brass shim stock that I cut real thin, and I wrapped it around the bottom of that lever arm, overlapped it, and glued it into position. It's solid. It's not, I don't think I'm worried about it going anywhere. But what that did was, because I made that a little bit wider when you install your trigger bar to see how it works. So now when I pull the trigger, it moves the trigger bar back, and it actually pushes on the sear backwards, releases the hammer before it comes up and gets stuck. Now what happens is that after you fire and your trigger bar is in that up position, this tab right here, the slide, moves backwards, and not only does it cock your hammer, but it also pushes down on the trigger bar, which disconnects it from the sear, and it also allows it to spring forward because the spring that's attached to this brings it forward. So I was able to solve my trigger problem by modifying my trigger bar. So I don't know if this is a problem with all, current version. This is a generation 4 WE G17, and I don't know if this is just a QC issue or you know, if all the production models are having the same problem. But I was pretty bummed. I was pretty bummed when I got out of the box because everything else about the pistol I like, and it just, like I said, it just had a horrible trigger on it. So until I did this mod, it would just get stuck. But now it works great. So let me see if I can get this back together for you real quick and show you how everything works. I guess I will install my trigger bar first. So you want to hook that spring and get that trigger bar back into your trigger. You have to line up the hole and install your pin. I'm installing from the left side now. Get that installed. Just pull your trigger a little bit to release it so that the trigger bar will come up. Put our spring back in. Put our valve blocker in. Putting my thumb over that so I don't lose it. Now you have to get that trigger bar back into the assembly. Make sure it goes up in that groove. And put this back into the frame. Install your pin. Oh, it went too far. Put your screw back in. Going to go ahead and cock my hammer. It's going to test fire here, and breaks. Now what happens is, see how your trigger is back, and that's replicating what a real Glock would do. If you dry fire a real Glock, the trigger is going to stay in the back position until you actually rack the slide or the slide recoils. Now in order to release that trigger, the slide will come along and push down on the trigger bar tab right here, and you'll see when I do that it's going to release the trigger, comes forward. So that's how it works. Let's go ahead and mount our slide. Now when you mount your slide, you want to make sure you cock your hammer, otherwise it's going to get stuck on the slide. This is back on, make sure that your locking tabs are up. So let's go ahead and we're cocked. You can see my trigger now, and I'm going to go right to my break point, and look, it comes back like it should, and I can feel exactly where my break is on my trigger right there, and it's going to break. It's going to reset right back to that point. Very audible reset, and then it's going to break again. So now I love this trigger. This is, little things like this get me excited, but this is a really nice trigger now on the WE. Before, like I said, it was horrible. I couldn't tolerate it. I would get to here, and the trigger would stick. I'd feel the trigger bar move into that groove or that slot in the housing. It'd get stuck, and then I'd have to, push even more. So really, it's working now the way that it should. It should break before that trigger gets stuck. So anyways, I hope this helps you. If you are having that problem with your WE trigger, maybe you can diagnose the problem and fix it. Thanks for watching, guys.